is Doug Chiang. I'm the Vice President and Executive Creative Director for Lucasfilm, and I get to oversee Star Wars designs for our feature films as well as our mixed media and even theme parks and video games. I mean, it's an interesting question because a lot of what I do in terms of concept design for film has kind of evolved, and it's actually gotten a lot more thorough. And I was very fortunate to work with George Lucas in designing the original, episodes 1, 2, and 3, because he was the one who kind of set up the template for future art departments, and he felt that it was very important to have designers like myself start working the minute he's starting to write. And he liked that because it was a very collaborative medium where I could inspire him by the artwork that I was creating. Likewise, I would be inspired by him by the words that he was writing. And so working back and forth, when I would create an image, it might spark an idea for him. He would throw something back for me, was really wonderful. And he insisted that the art departments for Star Wars, for example, the art directors and the artists always start on day one when he's writing, and that's very unusual. And the only parallel that I can find is when he was designing the original trilogy with Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnston. And when I started working with George in 1995 to design episodes 1, 2, and 3, we proceeded with that template, and it was great. I was one of the first artists hired. It was myself and Tara Whitlatch, and that process of designing from day one is something that I think is so valuable. And this is where the designs that we create we're really trying to help the director and the writer visualize the film. And it's so abstract at that point because they're just vague ideas. And so our job in those early days is to really put down on paper, help to spark the imagination of the writer. In this case, it was George. With other filmmakers since then, it's served the same purpose. And concept design, I think, is so critical. I mean, it's something that perhaps is underappreciated because it sets the template. It sets the aspirational goal for what the movie should be. And often, those aspirational visions create sort of the ideal vision of what the movie is. And then once you bring in the reality of schedules and times and budgets, that aspirational vision starts to, get lowered and lowered. And so that's why we always try to set that aspirational bar as high as possible, because we know from that moment on it's going to be lowered down. And so for all the films that I work on, we set it as high as possible. And it's one of the joys that I have working in production design is that we always try to go for something that's kind of unseen, unexpected. And often I'll get requests from directors, the classic one, which is, show me something that I haven't been seen before. And it's a really hard challenge because there's so much that has been done. But we always find that one vision, based on what the director wants to tell in his story, that we try to elevate that, that vision to as high of a form as possible. And it's sort of the most challenging part of my job is to find that vision that identifies and distinguishes our films from everybody else. That's a really interesting challenge that we have is when we're designing for these, we'll play with a lot of different ideas. And that's because, concept art, it's very quick and we can explore a lot of different things before we actually hit the bigger budgets of actual set construction. And so often we're asked to, okay, we like this idea, but let's play around with some variety to see if that is the absolute best idea. And so often we'll design something, we'll have a placeholder for like, this is what it should be. Now let's explore. And I love working with directors that will push me, and as far as possible, because sometimes I don't quite know if that's the best design. And I love collaborating with a director who has a vision, who will say, okay, that's great, but let's try this and this. And often what I find is that even if we come back full circle, back to the original design, we will do all this exploration and homework, and then we can feel very confident that the design that we end up with, that ends up on screen, is the absolute best design. There are other times where we will overthink a design, where we will redesign it and kind of like almost beat it to death in some ways. And that's okay too, because again, that's my job. It's to help the director see on paper the vision that he sees in his head, he or she sees in his head. And it's a really sort of a fun part of my job. It's very challenging because we're being asked to do something that sometimes is very hard to imagine. But I think by doing that, we will explore. And that's part of a big portion of my job is to really do that background exploration for all of the designs, whether it's a set, it's a character, or it's an environment. We have to feel confident that these are the best designs. Sometimes, though, we are given such a tight production schedule that we don't have the luxury of iterating. And so the ironic thing is that often our first few ideas are usually the strongest. And that's where I love the idea that, if I'm given a very short timeline to work within, we will try to hit these designs. And we know that, okay, this is pretty good. But then if we have the luxury to actually explore more, we might be able to increase it a little bit more. But if we don't have that, it's still a real solid design. The way I like to approach design or production design for a film is I always break it into two steps. The first phase is the aspirational vision. And that's why I try to, raise the bar as high as possible. And I try to create the vision that in a perfect world, if we had an unlimited budget and resources that we could attain. And so that's the first part is, really try to set that goal. The second phase of it comes in once we have a script. And once we know exactly what the scenes are that are taking place in these sets, and then I start to really then dissect, okay, well, what is realistic in terms of what we can build, given our time and our budget? How do we actually take the aspirational vision and actually make it buildable and executable? And so you really have to separate the two. And so in my workflow now, I do have sort of the first phase, which is the blue sky, and then the second phase, which is more thorough design. And they come hand in hand. Many times later on in the production, we will still try to do some blue sky work, exploration, if there's a new environment that's being called for in the script. But oftentimes, it will be a matter of compromising what that vision is. And so I'm always conscious of how do we execute something. I always have that in the back of my mind because I don't want to fall into a trap where I'm designing something that is unexecutable. And that's really important because as a production designer, you have to be conscious of all the different stages of production. Even though you may be focused on one part at one time in the schedule, I have to be aware, like, all the ripple effects that that set will have if I design it to this and it's approved, by the director to build such and such. If we can't build that, then I've kind of failed in my job. And so I have to be aware of that because ultimately I'm responsible for all of that. No, I think that's a real critical part of the design process, that we have to ground our designs in reality. And I learned a lot of this basically working with George, where he insisted that even though, many people may think Star Wars is a science fiction genre film, he never considered it that. He always thought of it as a period film, as a documentary. And we were just happened to be in another world, another place filming this. And that was his approach to the designs. And when I knew that or heard that from him, it completely transformed how I approach the designs for a Star Wars film, which is basically, we're really taking reality and just twisting a little bit. But 80% or 90% of it is anchored in our reality. And I think that part is so critical because it's really looking at common objects in an uncommon way, seeing it in a new context, or changing the scale, because it can turn the ordinary into something extraordinary. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're taking a fantastic design and rooting it in reality so that the audience can believe it. It doesn't become so fantastical where they look at it and they start to question things like, well, how does that work? What is it doing? Because the minute the audience starts to do that, you've kind of lost them. I mean, the film experience is to immerse the audience into the designs. So part of my job is to really create convincing designs that don't betray that reality. And some of the most effective designs that I've designed in the past films always had that ingredient in there, that foundation of reality, that level of realism. Even if we're kind of making that up, it's like, for instance, the pod racers. We know levitating devices are kind of normal in Star Wars. So we kind of get that as a buy. But beyond that, we also want to really figure out, okay, well, how do these vehicles function? And so there's a level of realism that we try to put onto the design that make them believable, but yet still address the fantastical part of the story. Lighting is really important. I mean, how it's evolved now, concept art used to be different phases where you design something in the abstract environment where it's a line sketch on a white background, for instance, and then you put it into a background, then you put set dressing, then you put lighting. All those phases now are tied into one. So from day one, we're designing sets and characters in an environment with set dressing, with textures, and with lighting. And the reason we do that is to help inform the idea to the director. So the director can actually look at a piece of concept art now and know that that is an image that he or she wants to see up on the screen. On the big screen. And it's really important to factor in lighting because you almost have to put on a director of photography cap on when you design these things. Just like when I'm designing a set, I have to put on my set decorator hat to figure out, okay, how would I set decorate this? By having a DP's sensibility when I'm designing a scene, it really helps to inform, okay, well, how much of the set will be seen? How much will be in darkness? How much depth of field do we have? Because ultimately, all of those factors decide how thorough we should build the sets. And this is something, as a production designer, you have to be conscious of throughout the whole entire design process. And so I try to build in lighting as quickly as possible, because ultimately you're trying to sell an idea that's going to end up on a screen. And if it's overlit, it's not going to work. Now, I drew a lot of my inspirations from history and from research. And this was one of the big lessons that I learned when I started working with George, was that he felt very strongly that we should always do research, that you figure out, in order to design a future, you look into the past. And it's the way you look into the past, how you mix and match the ingredients, because there's thousands of years of human culture that we can draw upon. And it's much more effective to actually draw upon that human culture history of design and elevate it and put it into a new context than to create something out of thin air. For example, this was one of his main points, was that when we're designing costumes, we always try to anchor it in a specific culture that we can relate to, and then we update it by either having mix and match pieces or just mixing timelines. But what happens when you do that is that you're grounding the designs already in something that is very real, because there's all that history that's behind the designs. On the other hand, if you're designing something completely out of thin air, just kind of making it up as you go, you fall into the danger of having these designs then become outdated very quickly. And one of the things that I admire about the Star Wars design is that they're always timeless. And that was because we were grounding them in history. To become a production designer, it's actually evolved. The craft itself has evolved over the past decade, and it's changed in many ways. And one of them is that before it used to be very segmented. You're there in pre-production and production, and then in post-production, the production designer is normally not part of that process. That changed completely when I was working with George, because he felt very strongly that the designer should be involved throughout the whole process. And it's something now that I find more relevant, especially when we get into different kinds of filmmaking, where it's maybe synthetic filmmaking, meaning digital filmmaking, where the images are not captured live on camera, but they're created after the fact. And so the production designer's role actually has to start from day one, all the way through to production, all the way into production, as well into post-production. And by doing that, it actually gives a strong visual continuity, which is really important, because often without that continuity, then you're relying on the director, and that's almost too much of a burden to put on the director, because they have so many other things to deal with. And so my role as a production designer is to help oversee that vision, so that what is approved from day one in terms of what the director or the writer is writing in the script is carried all the way through to production, how it's shot, how it's executed, all the way into post. Often now, a big portion of our design process happens in post, because so much can change. Once we have our first assembly of the film, the director may want to massage the sets to kind of, get the point across better. Or things might change where we need a new set and we'll recreate it digitally. So the design process doesn't end when principal photography ends. It continues all the way to the release of the film. The whole process of design now is very immersive, in the sense that I have to put on multiple hats. In the beginning, I'm part storyboard artist, I'm part previs, artist as well. And that evolves all the way throughout the process. In the middle of production, I'm part construction, I'm part architect, and then in post, I'm part visual effects as well, in terms of visual effects art direction. And so the production design role has really evolved quite a bit by the nature of the films and the process that we're designing and evolving now. And it's actually become much more immersive, where it's an all-encompassing role. And it's not to say that my job is the most important. Of course it's not. But I'm one of many. And because the craft and the evolution of the filmmaking style has changed quite a bit, the role of the production designer has to evolve as well. Yeah, filmmaking by its nature is a very collaborative art form. My goal is, as a production designer, is always to service the director. The director has the vision, and it's my job to help fulfill that vision. Many times when I'm working with other department heads, we're all funneling that creative energy to service the director's vision. And it'll change quite a bit. And a lot of times when I'm on a film production, I don't have the answers. I don't have all the answers. I have some of the answers. And so I work with the different department heads to find those answers. And I kind of help orchestrate and corral that into the vision that the director wants. And so my role changes. In the very beginning, it's working with storyboard artists, it's working with concept artists. And now I even get in there and design things myself. As it goes into production, I'm working with construction people, in order to figure out, okay, how much of the set should we build? How do we build it? And how do we build it, in a meaningful way within the schedule. And then in post-production, it's working with the visual effects supervisors to figure out, okay, well, how do we execute this now? Now that it's kind of, the film process has evolved into their process, how do we keep the vision of the director? And often, things will change quite a bit. And it's my role to kind of help guide that. And definitely if the visual effects art director or any other people along that pathway has a better idea, we will adopt it. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like the best ideas are the ones that win. It doesn't have to come from me, and most of the times it doesn't. It's just, finding those threads of best ideas, because at the end of the day, we want to put the best ideas on the screen. Part of the design process for film is very complex. I mean, there's a lot of creative people offering a lot of different opinions about certain things. And I find it really challenging that sometimes along the way, you'll get a lot of strong voices, and sometimes they may not have the keen eye for what the best design should be. And it's part of my job to sort of navigate all that. And what I found to be most successful is when I'm working with a director who has a really strong vision. And sometimes some of the craziest ideas are the best ones. And it's part of my job to help define what that crazy idea is. Sometimes, though, I have to admit, I mean, I've seen examples where that crazy idea is pushed too far out to the extreme, where it really takes the audience out of the film experience. And when that happens, it almost hurts the story, because then you've lost the audience. And so what I try to do is never let that happen, because I think it's very important to always keep the audience engaged so that they never question what they're seeing. They just fall into it. They believe what they're seeing. There's a level of realism in there. And so my approach right now to design, even if I'm asked to create something really fantastic, is I'll try to put sort of a sensible reality to it, because I know that at the end of the day, I'm one of the biggest fans. And if I don't believe that design, it's not going to work. So I want to create a design that I can believe in.